Car companies love to dream big, but sometimes those dreams turn into nightmares on wheels. Through the years, automakers have rolled out prototypes that were supposed to be futuristic marvels, but instead ended up looking ridiculous, driving horribly, or making zero sense at all. These machines were so far off the mark that it's hard to believe anyone greenlit them in the first place. Get ready, because today we're diving into 15 dumbest old car prototypes that should have never existed.
Dear viewers, we have set a goal to reach 30,000 subscribers by the end of this year. With your support, we can make it happen, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey. Thank you.
The 1936 Stout Scarab is one of those strange chapters in American automotive history that feels almost like a fever dream. Conceived by William Bushnell Stout, an aviation engineer who believed cars could be designed like airplanes, it was promoted as America's first minivan, decades before Chrysler would ever coin the term. The Scarab was unlike anything else on the road in the mid-1930s, a futuristic, aluminum-bodied machine shaped like a swollen beetle or an overinflated bread loaf. Its rounded insect-like design made it stand out in an era dominated by long hoods, upright grills, and flowing Art Deco lines. To most passersby, it looked like a strange alien pod dropped onto the highway, and to potential buyers, it looked less like a luxury car and more like a rolling joke. But Stout's vision was deadly serious. He believed the traditional three-box car design was outdated, and he wanted to create something closer to a mobile living room. To that end, the Scarab was designed with a rear-mounted Ford flathead V8 hidden under the floor, freeing up the front end for passengers and eliminating the conventional hood. The result was a flat, cavernous interior unlike anything else available at the time. The Scarab had rotating captain's chairs, a fold-out table, and a lounge-like layout that felt more like stepping into an airplane cabin or a futuristic living pod than a car. Stout essentially reinvented the idea of the car as a social space, rather than just a mode of transportation, making it the spiritual ancestor of the family minivan and the luxury conversion van that wouldn't appear for decades. Unfortunately, vision and execution were two very different things. While the concept of a rolling living room was groundbreaking, the Scarab was far too weird for its time. Its ungainly exterior design inspired more laughter than admiration, earning nicknames like the aluminum bug or bread loaf on wheels. In a decade where cars like the Cadillac V16 and Chrysler Airflow were admired for elegance and style, the Scarab looked like something a child might draw with crayons. Its aerodynamic shape was far ahead of its time, but to the average buyer, it simply looked alien and ugly. And then there was the price. The Scarab cost nearly $5,000 in 1936, more than some mansions and about 10 times the cost of a Ford sedan. At a time when the Great Depression had crippled disposable income, asking that much for what appeared to be a giant rolling insect was a recipe for disaster. Driving the Scarab was also less revolutionary than Stout had hoped. With its Ford flathead V8, the powertrain was familiar and reliable, but the car's size and weight made it sluggish and unwieldy. Its independent suspension was innovative for the time, offering a smoother ride than many competitors, but the vehicle's odd proportions and unusual weight distribution made it feel more like piloting a small bus than driving a luxury car. Buyers expecting a futuristic machine with futuristic performance quickly learned that aside from its spacious interior, the Scarab didn't deliver much more than novelty. Production was almost non-existent. Depending on which source you believe, only 9 or 10 Scarabs were ever built, most by hand. Each was custom-made with different interior layouts depending on what eccentric millionaire buyer wanted. Some were used by Stout's wealthy aviation friends as personal limousines, others as promotional showpieces, but the car never entered anything close to mass production. Stout had dreamed of creating a revolution, but the Scarab's extreme cost, bizarre styling, and lack of practicality killed it before it had a chance. Today, the surviving Scarabs are museum pieces, treated as fascinating oddities rather than examples of automotive brilliance. They're praised for their forward-thinking ideas, rear-mounted engines, open interiors, aerodynamic shapes, but laughed at for their execution. They embody the danger of being too far ahead of one's time. The world simply wasn't ready for a vehicle that combined the ugliness of a melted beetle with the price tag of a mansion. In retrospect, the 1936 Stout Scarab is both a failure and a strange kind of success. It failed to sell, failed to inspire imitators in its own era, and failed to find an audience in Depression-era America. Yet it succeeded in planting seeds that would not fully bloom until the 1980s, when minivans became the dominant family vehicle. The Scarab remains a monument to eccentric engineering, a car so weird and impractical that it was doomed from the start, yet visionary enough that we can now look back on it with both amusement and admiration. It is remembered not as the car that changed the world, but as the bizarre aluminum bug that might have, if only the world had been ready for it. Would you like me to make this even longer, with more ridicule and over-the-top mockery of just how ridiculous the Scarab looked and how badly it failed with buyers?
The 1955 Lincoln Futura is one of those cars so catastrophically misguided that it almost transcends bad design and becomes something else entirely. A rolling spectacle of absurdity, a monument to hubris, and a case study in how a team of engineers and stylists can lose all sense of proportion, taste, and practicality in a single stroke. It wasn't just a bad idea, it was a bad idea inflated to the size of a small yacht, coated in chrome, and topped off with what looked like two giant goldfish bowls fused to the roof. At a time when Detroit was already obsessed with fins, rocket ships, and atomic-age fantasy, Lincoln decided to go all in and create the car of tomorrow. Except their vision of tomorrow looked like a science fiction parody that even Flash Gordon would have rejected. The Futura was nearly 19 feet long, wide enough to clog half a lane on its own, and sat there like a swollen caricature of what a luxury car was supposed to be. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't graceful. It looked like a spaceship designed by people who had only heard about spaceships in drunken conversations. Let's start with the most infamous feature, the double plexiglass bubble domes. Two huge, transparent bubbles, one for the driver and one for the passenger, like twin fish tanks mounted on top of the car. They were meant to look futuristic, as if the driver and passenger were jet pilots blasting into orbit. In reality, they turned the interior into an unbearable greenhouse, trapping heat in a way that made air conditioning useless. Sit inside for 5 minutes on a sunny day, and you'd feel like a chicken roasting in a convection oven. The domes fogged up, they amplified glare, and they made anyone inside look utterly ridiculous, like a lab specimen being wheeled to an experiment. No one with a shred of dignity could pull up to a dinner party in this car without becoming the night's punchline. Then there were the fins. Good Lord, the fins. Cadillac may have popularized the tail fin, but Lincoln's Futura turned it into self-parody. These fins weren't elegant blades or subtle suggestions of motion. No, they were hulking slabs of metal that jutted skyward like the vertical stabilizers on a crashed airplane. They didn't serve any aerodynamic purpose. They didn't even flow with the lines of the car. They just sat there, massive and stupid, daring people to laugh. If you parked the Futura next to a Cadillac Eldorado of the same era, the Cadillac looked restrained, tasteful, even conservative. That's how absurd the Futura's fins were. And chrome. So much chrome. The entire front end looked like someone had melted down a diner and bolted it to the car. The grille, the bumper, the trim, it all sparkled in a way that bordered on blinding. It wasn't luxury, it was tacky excess, as if Lincoln were trying to outshine the sun itself. Walk in front of the Futura at the wrong angle, and you risk being blinded for life. Inside, the car was no better.
The futuristic dashboard was all gimmicks, with knobs and shapes that looked exciting on paper, but worked about as well as toys from a cereal box. The seating position was awkward, the visibility was terrible thanks to the domes, and the steering wheel was so large it felt like you were piloting a tugboat rather than driving a car. Underneath it all, the Futura was basically just a Lincoln chassis. It had no breakthrough powertrain or futuristic mechanics. It was an ordinary car buried under an avalanche of styling madness. And for all of this, the cost was astronomical. Reports suggest that building the Futura set Lincoln back over $250,000 in 1955, money that could have bought you a mansion, a fleet of Cadillacs, or even a private plane. For that price, what did Lincoln get? A bloated embarrassment that nobody took seriously. It was so impractical, so bizarre, and so absurd that production was never even considered. It was a concept car, in the truest sense, built only to shock, and even that it failed, because the shock quickly gave way to ridicule. But here's where the story takes its strangest turn. The Futura, destined to rot in obscurity, was rescued, not by Lincoln, not by collectors, but by Hollywood. George Barris, a customizer with a flair for the outrageous, got his hands on the car in the 1960s for next to nothing. He slapped on some fiberglass arches, added a few gadgets, painted it black, and turned it into the Batmobile for the 1966 Batman TV series. Suddenly, the same car that had been laughed at for being ridiculous became beloved for being ridiculous. On TV, surrounded by campy costumes and pow, zap fight scenes, the Futura's idiocy finally made sense. It was a perfect match for a comic book world where nothing had to be practical, tasteful, or dignified. That's the great irony of the Lincoln Futura. As a concept car, it was a disaster. As a serious vision of the automotive future, it was laughable. But as a TV prop, it was perfect. Strip away the Batman paint job, though, and the truth remains. The Futura was one of the ugliest, dumbest, and most impractical concept cars of all time. A clown car dressed up as a luxury dream. Without Batman, it would be forgotten. With Batman, it survives as a camp icon, forever immortalized, not for what it achieved, but for how hilariously wrong it went. Do you want me to make the next version even more theatrical, almost like a roast where I tear apart every single design detail with mockery, comparing it to circus tents, carnival rides, and alien trash cans?
The 1959 Cadillac Cyclone is one of those cars that could only have been created in the late 1950s, when Detroit was high on chrome, paranoia, and atomic-age fantasies. It wasn't really a car so much as it was a fever dream given wheels, a concept born from Harley Earl's obsession with rockets, airplanes, and outer space. At a glance, it looked less like something you could drive and more like a leftover prop from a Cold War science fiction movie, half spaceship, half missile launcher, and completely impractical as a real vehicle. The nose was its most infamous feature. Two giant black fiberglass cones jutting forward, looking like the tips of guided missiles ready to fire. These cones weren't for style alone. They were supposedly housing Cadillac's new radar collision avoidance system. The pitch was simple. The car could sense obstacles ahead and warn the driver, a bit like modern adaptive cruise control. The reality, though, was that the sensors were little more than theater. They didn't work in practice, not even close. What GM had really created was a Cadillac with fake weapons bolted to the front, a car that looked like it was going to war with traffic instead of blending into it. Imagine pulling into your suburban driveway in 1959 and scaring the neighbors into thinking you joined the Strategic Air Command. The Cyclone's ridiculousness didn't stop there. The canopy roof was made from clear plexiglass bubbles, creating what looked like a mobile greenhouse. The idea was to give passengers a panoramic view, as if they were fighter jet pilots rather than motorists. The problem, of course, was that in real-world conditions, the greenhouse turned into an oven. GM engineers tried to fix this by coating the canopy with a chemical that darkened automatically in bright sunlight, but the effect was patchy and often left passengers squinting. The solution? Crude, early air conditioning that had to work overtime just to keep the interior habitable. You weren't piloting a futuristic Cadillac, you were baking slowly in a rolling terrarium. Then there were the doors. Instead of swinging out like on a normal car, they slid backwards into the rear fenders. This might sound futuristic, but in practice it was awkward, heavy, and deeply impractical. It made getting in and out of the car a clumsy spectacle, and worse, it left you with gaping open cavities in the rear fenders when the doors retracted. If you lived in a rainy climate, those cavities filled with water like fish tanks. If you lived in a snowy climate, they jammed with ice. It was a party trick that nobody actually needed, the sort of engineering solution that created more problems than it solved. And of course, Cadillac's obsession with fins reached absurd new levels on the Cyclone. They were long, needle-sharp, and extended so far back that they practically looked like weapons. You could probably slice your hand open if you brushed against them too fast. They weren't even graceful like the '59 Cadillac production cars. These fins looked bolted on, exaggerated, like a parody of Cadillac's own style. The whole vehicle was more cartoon than car, a caricature of futuristic thinking. Driving it didn't redeem the experience either. Sure, it had Cadillac's 390 cubic inch V8 under the hood, but everything else made it cumbersome. The giant canopy distorted vision, the radar cones blocked sightlines, and the entire car had the turning radius of a parade float. Reviews at the time weren't glowing because nobody outside GM's design department ever really believed this was a car for the road. It was pure fantasy, a traveling circus act of chrome, plexiglass, and gimmickry. The Cyclone never made it past the concept stage, and thank goodness it didn't. It was far too bizarre and impractical to ever be sold to the public. Cadillac rolled it out at auto shows, called it the car of the future, and then quietly parked it in storage when the laughter became too loud. Today, it exists mostly as a museum piece, a reminder of how wild, unrestrained, and sometimes downright embarrassing 1950s concept cars could be. Unlike many prototypes that aged into elegance, the Cyclone still looks absurd, as though it was designed by someone who thought the space race meant Americans actually wanted to drive rocket ships to the grocery store. In hindsight, the 1959 Cadillac Cyclone is more of a cultural artifact than a car. It represents an era when designers truly believed the future would be all domes, fins, and radar beams, but also serves as proof that what looks exciting on paper can turn into an impractical joke in metal. It's equal parts fascinating and laughable, a bread loaf of paranoia on wheels, forever trapped in the twilight zone between fantasy and farce.
The 1961 ZIL 112 sports prototype is one of the most extraordinary failures in automotive history. A car that encapsulates the extremes of Cold War ambition, technological overreach, and bureaucratic spectacle. Imagine the Soviet Union in the early 1960s, a nation obsessed with proving its superiority over the West in every field, from rockets to tanks to Olympic medals. Somewhere in the minds of Soviet planners, it was decided that if Italy could build Ferraris and America could build Corvettes, the USSR could certainly field a sports car that would make the world take notice. The task fell to ZIL, normally the builder of massive limousines for Soviet officials, vehicles designed to swallow entire entourages and roll imperiously through Red Square. Suddenly, these engineers were asked to build a nimble, agile, world-class supercar. The result was the ZIL 112 sports prototype, a car that was simultaneously ambitious, heavy-handed, impractical, and laughably flawed. From the first glance, the ZIL 112 seems like a plausible Ferrari rival. Its low-slung, wedge-shaped body suggested speed. Its long hood and truncated rear gave the impression of aerodynamic sophistication. And the cockpit was tight and purposeful, clearly intended for serious driving. Yet all of this promise was undermined by the realities of Soviet engineering priorities and industrial limitations. Where Italian or American sports cars of the same era prioritized lightness, balance, and precision handling, the ZIL 112 was clumsy, ponderous, and overweight. Its chassis, derived from the company's experience building limousines, could barely manage its own mass, let alone provide the agile dynamics expected from a supercar. The car felt like a lion trying to dance ballet, majestic in theory, awkward in execution. The engine, supposedly the centerpiece of the vehicle, was a source of continual frustration. Reports vary, but it is clear that the V8, or V12 in some iterations, was powerful enough on paper to justify the car's ambitions, yet in reality it was plagued by overheating, temperamental fuel delivery, and inconsistent performance. Driving the ZIL 112 was an endurance test. The cooling system was inadequate, the exhausts smoked, and the power was unpredictable. In some ways, it was a car that punished its driver for daring to demand performance. Anyone hoping for a true Ferrari competitor would have been quickly disabused of the notion, left instead with a vehicle that seemed designed for propaganda and photo ops rather than actual driving. And indeed, propaganda was the car's primary purpose. The ZIL 112 was built not to dominate racetracks, but to symbolize Soviet technological prowess. It appeared at exhibitions and official events, polished and gleaming, a testament to the USSR's ability to match the West in style and innovation. Yet its performance did not back up its image. Behind the wheel, engineers and officials alike had to contend with a car that overheated quickly, handled like a brick, and broke down more often than it functioned. Its very existence was a contradiction. Intended to inspire awe, it often inspired pity or laughter. The styling of the ZIL 112 is particularly fascinating, a blend of aspiration and awkward execution. Its sleek lines were clearly inspired by Western supercars, yet the execution was heavy, overbuilt, and slightly crude. The cockpit was tight, the seats Spartan, and the interior controls functional but far from refined. Every glance inside revealed a car caught between two worlds, one foot in Soviet industrial pragmatism, one foot in Italian sports car fantasy. On the outside, it looked like a machine capable of glory. On the inside, it was a temperamental, sweat-inducing experience, with controls that required brute force rather than finesse. Driving the ZIL 112 even under ideal conditions would have been an exercise in frustration. The car's weight and poor balance meant that cornering was an ordeal, acceleration was inconsistent, and the engine's tendency to overheat forced frequent stops. It was simultaneously dangerous and underwhelming, a car that promised adrenaline, but delivered anxiety. Every attempt to push it to its limits risked catastrophic failure, turning what should have been the thrill of driving into a constant game of damage control. Only a handful of ZIL 112 prototypes were ever built, each one more of a demonstration piece than a viable sports car. They were intended to show the world that the Soviet Union could innovate in every sector. Yet the cars themselves rarely left test tracks. They were photographed, paraded, and polished for propaganda purposes. But in terms of real automotive achievement, they fell far short. The ZIL 112 exists today almost entirely as a curiosity, a reminder of how ambition, ideology, and limited experience can collide to produce something simultaneously impressive and absurd. In the end, the 1961 ZIL 112 sports prototype is a monument to what happens when a government decides to play supercar designer without the necessary expertise or industrial ecosystem to support it. It is heavy where it should be light, clumsy where it should be nimble, and temperamental where it should be reliable. It is a car that could barely run, overheated constantly, and handled like a brick. But it looked good in photographs and fulfilled its true purpose, propaganda. The ZIL 112 remains a fascinating artifact, an example of Cold War ambition run amok, a Soviet Ferrari that existed more in imagination than reality, and a vehicle whose legacy is defined as much by failure and spectacle as by any technical achievement. If you want, I can make an even longer, cinematic version, imagining a full day in the life of someone attempting to actually drive the ZIL 112, filled with overheating disasters, bureaucratic absurdity, and Cold War propaganda theater. This could make it feel like a fully immersive story rather than just a description. Do you want me to do that?
The 1963 Volkswagen EA128 stands as one of the most fascinating "what were they thinking" moments in automotive history. A car that embodies the dangers of ambition untethered from practicality. At a time when Volkswagen was enjoying global success thanks to the humble Beetle, an icon of simplicity, reliability, and efficiency, the company decided to chase a completely different dream, a luxury sedan infused with Porsche-inspired styling and aspirations. On paper, the EA128 was supposed to project sophistication, performance, and modernity, an aspirational vehicle that could take Volkswagen from mass-market darling to a serious contender in the luxury segment. In reality, it was a lumbering, oversized, awkward, and utterly impractical machine that managed to contradict every principle that had made Volkswagen successful in the first place. The very first thing that strikes anyone who lays eyes on the EA128 is its scale. Unlike the compact, approachable cars that had made Volkswagen a household name, this car is long, wide, and heavy, so heavy that its performance could never live up to its aggressive styling. The designers seemed determined to make a vehicle that screamed importance and modernity, yet in doing so, they created something that looked strained and uncomfortable, as if the car's own body could barely support the ambitions of its creators. From the low, sloping roof to the stretched hood and awkwardly extended rear deck, the proportions are ungainly, leaving the EA128 teetering between futuristic aspiration and pure clumsiness. It's as though the car is perpetually leaning forward, desperate to impress, but weighed down by the impossibility of its own size. Inside, the story continues. Volkswagen attempted to combine Porsche-like driver focus with luxury comforts, but the result was contradictory and awkward. The cabin is spacious, but the materials are a confusing blend of pseudo-luxury trims and industrial austerity. The dashboard, inspired by Porsche's clean and purposeful layout, ends up feeling bulky, with oversized gauges and controls that seem designed more for visual impact than ergonomic functionality. Anyone attempting to sit behind the wheel would feel a disconnect. The car promises a sophisticated driving experience, yet it delivers discomfort, confusion, and a sense that every control has been transplanted without regard for human interaction. The seats, though roomy, lack the support needed for spirited driving, turning even a short trip into a test of patience. Mechanically, the EA128 is equally compromised. Volkswagen tried to marry Porsche-inspired performance with the familiar air-cooled engines and mechanical simplicity that had defined the Beetle. The result was a misalignment of purpose. The car is far too heavy for the modest powertrain, acceleration is sluggish, handling is awkward, and braking is uninspiring. The EA128 lumbered down roads like a car forced to carry the ambitions of an entire company on its back. What should have been a dynamic, exciting experience became instead a clumsy, laborious exercise in how slow can we make a luxury car feel. Even driving in a straight line required patience. Cornering demanded more courage than precision. The exterior design, intended to convey modernity and prestige, is perhaps the EA128's greatest failure. Borrowing from Porsche's contemporary sports sedans, it nevertheless suffers from awkward proportions, a too long hood, and a rear that seems truncated and tacked on. The lines are forced, angular, and lack cohesion. Its visual impact is neither elegant nor imposing. It is strained, awkward, and self-conscious. The car projects a sense of trying too hard, like a teenager in an ill-fitting tuxedo attempting to masquerade as an adult. Pedestrians, critics, and car enthusiasts at the time reportedly reacted with confusion and bemusement. It was a car designed to impress, yet it did little more than elicit raised eyebrows and stifled laughter.
The EA128's failures weren't just aesthetic or mechanical, they were conceptual. Volkswagen had built a car that contradicted everything that made the brand successful: simplicity, reliability, efficiency, and a connection with ordinary drivers. Instead of designing a car that felt natural and attainable, they created an aspirational vehicle that could only frustrate. Its size made parking a nightmare, its handling made it dangerous in corners, and its clumsy acceleration and braking undermined any claim to performance. In a real-world context, it was a car almost impossible to love and completely unfit for the roads it might have faced. Ultimately, the EA128 never progressed beyond the prototype stage, and rightly so. It stands as a cautionary tale in automotive history, a vivid example of how ambition without restraint, or a brand straying too far from its roots, can produce something both impractical and aesthetically misguided. What Volkswagen intended as a step upmarket, a Porsche-influenced prestige sedan, instead became a lumbering, ungainly, and unattractive relic that contradicted everything the company represented. It was oversized, awkward, and conceptually confused, a vehicle whose very existence seemed to whisper, "This was a mistake." Today, the EA128 survives only in photographs and the memories of historians, an artifact of a rare misstep for a brand that otherwise excels at consistency and purpose. It serves as a reminder that even the most successful automakers are capable of spectacularly missing the mark when ambition exceeds practicality. In every dimension, size, aesthetics, mechanics, and philosophy, the EA128 is the antithesis of Volkswagen's genius. It is pretentious, cumbersome, and profoundly unlovable. And yet, in its audacious failure, it becomes fascinating. A vision of what could have been, a lesson in hubris, and a permanent symbol of a moment when Volkswagen briefly strayed too far from the path that had made it a global icon.
The 1966 Toyota EX Dream Car is less a vehicle and more a rolling fantasy, a monument to mid-1960s automotive imagination run entirely unchecked. At a time when Japan was just beginning to rebuild itself as an industrial powerhouse, Toyota was carving out a reputation for reliability, efficiency, and practicality, with compact cars like the Corona and the Publica. Against this backdrop, the EX Dream Car emerges like a spark from another world, a wedge-shaped, fin-laden, bubble canopy spectacle that seems entirely disconnected from the realities of Japanese roads, driving conditions, or consumer expectations. It was a car that existed purely to dazzle, a visual manifestation of Toyota designers' dreams of space-age speed, futuristic aesthetics, and show-stopping theater. The moment you lay eyes on the EX, you are confronted with its audacious proportions and theatrical styling. The wedge shape dominates the design, plunging sharply from a pointed nose to an elevated rear, creating the illusion of forward motion even while stationary. Oversized rear fins protrude dramatically, sweeping upward like the tailplanes of a rocket ship, so exaggerated that they almost defy belief, threatening to scrape the ceilings of parking garages or poke unwary pedestrians. At the front, the long, pointed nose stretches aggressively forward, accompanied by a canopy-style bubble cockpit that seems better suited to a fighter jet than a street-legal automobile. Every line, curve, and protrusion scream spectacle over practicality, ensuring that this car would never blend into city traffic. It was built to stand out, to arrest attention, and to make the onlookers pause in awe or disbelief. Inside, the EX Dream Car continues its defiance of conventional automotive sense. The cockpit is encased in a wraparound plexiglass bubble, offering panoramic visibility, but at the cost of comfort, privacy, and climate control. Entry and exit are awkward and theatrical, requiring contortions reminiscent of stepping into a carnival ride rather than a sedan. The dashboard is cluttered with oversized switches, levers, and dials, most of which were decorative or experimental rather than functional, emphasizing the car's role as spectacle over utility. The seating is tight and uncomfortable, yet designed to suggest high performance.
The interior, in short, is a theater set masquerading as a cockpit, prioritizing showmanship above all else. Mechanically, the EX Dream Car is as impractical as its appearance suggests. While it carries the aura of a futuristic Porsche-inspired sports machine, the engineering never matched the vision. The chassis, suspension, and powertrain were secondary concerns to styling and concept presentation. Performance was theoretical. The car could presumably move under its own power, but speed, handling, and reliability were likely poor, and real-world usability was non-existent. The vehicle is in effect a showpiece that exists to impress spectators and journalists at auto shows, not to navigate Tokyo's narrow streets or survive daily commuting. Its style is unapologetically over the top, a testament to the optimism and daring of Japanese automotive designers in the 1960s. The wedge shape, fins, and bubble canopy all scream space-age futurism, yet they are exaggerated to the point of absurdity. For Japanese consumers of the era, accustomed to small, reliable, and practical vehicles, the EX must have seemed like a cartoonish dream, a vehicle both seductive and entirely unattainable. It is easy to imagine drivers craning their necks in traffic, pedestrians gaping, and journalists writing breathless copy about a car that could never exist outside the controlled environment of a show floor. It also symbolizes a period of unrestrained ambition in automotive design. Toyota allowed its designers to imagine freely, unbound by production realities, emissions regulations, or consumer practicality. The result is a vehicle that is thrilling to behold, but utterly impossible to live with. Parking would be a nightmare. Tight city streets would be a constant challenge. Maintenance would be speculative at best. Every feature that was intended to be futuristic, the bubble canopy, exaggerated fins, and wedge body, was simultaneously a barrier to usability. In essence, the EX was designed for the eyes, not for the hands. The 1966 Toyota EX Dream Car never made it beyond the concept stage, and for very good reasons. It was impossible to produce, impractical to drive, and completely unsuited to the realities of daily life. Yet, as a concept, it achieved exactly what it was intended to do: astonish, inspire, and showcase Toyota's vision of a thrilling, futuristic automobile. Today, it survives as an icon of mid-century ambition and imagination, a reminder of what happens when automotive designers dream without restraint. The EX is audacious, theatrical, and utterly fantastical, a rocket ship masquerading as a car, a spectacle meant to captivate rather than transport.
The 1968 Marcos Mantis XP is one of those rare examples of automotive ambition running so far ahead of itself that it collapsed under its own weight, vision, and lack of practicality. Marcos, a small British sports car company known for lightweight, hand-built vehicles, attempted with the Mantis XP to leap into futuristic design, creating a wedge-shaped prototype so radical it seemed almost like an art installation rather than a car. But ambition without execution can be cruel, and the Mantis XP was a textbook case of style without substance, a vehicle so extreme that it looked perpetually unfinished, functionally flawed, and emotionally exhausting even to those who built it. At first glance, the Mantis XP is arresting. Its wedge body is sharp, angular, and aggressive, with lines designed to evoke speed and modernity. The low nose and sloping roof make it look like it was sliced from a piece of geometry rather than sculpted for human use. Yet the radical shape comes with consequences. Visibility is almost non-existent. Driving the car is less about seeing the road and more about trusting that the vehicle is pointing roughly in the right direction. The front windshield is tiny and steeply angled, the side windows are slits, barely wide enough to see through, and the rear window is virtually useless. The car turns what should be a simple act of driving into a constant exercise in guesswork, relying on intuition over actual sight. Inside, the Mantis XP is equally unkind. The cabin is cramped, claustrophobic, and poorly finished, with gaps and leaks that make it feel more like a prototype testing jig than a livable sports car. Rain, wind, and dirt infiltrate relentlessly, turning even a short drive into a battle with the elements. The seats are minimal, offering little support, and the controls are oddly positioned, reflecting the rushed, experimental nature of the project. The car's designers themselves reportedly disliked it, recognizing that while the concept was visually striking, it was fundamentally unlivable as a vehicle. Driving the Mantis XP was less an act of enjoyment and more an endurance test, with every journey highlighting the compromise between futuristic aesthetics and basic functionality. Mechanically, the Mantis XP was far from perfect. As with many low-volume British prototypes of the era, reliability was marginal. The body panels were prone to flex and misalign, the engine and transmission suffered from minor but frequent quirks, and every puddle on the road seemed to find a way inside the car. Performance was secondary to appearance, meaning that while it could move forward, it offered no thrills and little confidence. The car's weight distribution, handling, and aerodynamics were theoretical rather than practical, leaving drivers constantly aware of the prototype's limitations. Aesthetically, the Mantis XP is a study in contradiction. On paper, it was intended to look futuristic, cutting-edge and modern, an ultra-low British wedge that might have competed visually with Italian or American concepts of the late 1960s. In reality, it looks unfinished, extreme, and slightly awkward. Every angle seems exaggerated, every panel feels overstretched, every line screams ambition rather than coherence. Even today, photographs of the car evoke curiosity, bewilderment, and a hint of sympathy, as if the car is an experiment that overreached its own design brief. The Mantis XP's place in automotive history is largely symbolic. It represents a period when British sports car makers were willing to experiment boldly, embracing radical forms and radical ideas, often with limited resources. Yet it also serves as a cautionary tale. Pushing the envelope visually and conceptually without attention to practicality or engineering leads to vehicles that are uncomfortable, unreliable, and even hated by their creators. Marcos attempted to create a wedge-shaped marvel, but the Mantis XP became a walking contradiction. Exciting to look at, impossible to drive, and despised by the very people who dared to dream it into existence. Today, the 1968 Marcos Mantis XP survives in historical memory as a curio, a car admired for daring but derided for execution. Its extreme wedge body, minimal visibility, constant leaks, and awkward handling make it clear why it never entered production. It is a vehicle designed to dazzle the eye, but it is also a machine that punishes anyone who tries to drive it. The Mantis XP is simultaneously fascinating, frustrating, and a little tragic. A British sports car that reached for the future and tripped spectacularly on the realities of engineering and human usability.
The 1969 Holden Hurricane is one of the most audacious, flamboyant, and impractically ambitious concept cars ever produced in Australia. A machine that seems as if it were ripped straight from the pages of a futuristic comic book rather than designed for real-world driving. Conceived during a period when Holden wanted to demonstrate that the Australian automotive industry could rival the creativity and daring of Europe and America, the Hurricane was intended as a bold statement, a supercar of the future, a technological marvel, and a dramatic symbol of innovation. But for all its ambition, the Hurricane was entirely unsuited to the harsh realities of Australian roads, environments, and driver expectations. It was a car built to dazzle the eye, not to survive the outback. The Hurricane's design is spectacular, almost surreal. Its long, wedge-shaped body stretches dramatically, tapering toward a pointed nose that suggests speed even while standing still. The rear flares elegantly, exaggerating the car's low-slung aerodynamic profile. But the pièce de résistance is the gull-wing canopy, a single sweeping roof section that lifts to allow entry and exit. It is theatrical to the extreme, evoking images of spacecraft rather than automobiles. Inside, traditional side mirrors are replaced with tiny cameras feeding live images to screens within the cabin, a technology so far ahead of its time that it feels more science fiction than engineering. Every line, every panel, every exaggerated fin and curve communicates drama, ambition, and imagination, but none of it addresses basic functionality, usability, or durability.
The interior continues this vision of the future motif, yet it is entirely impractical. The cabin is tight and sculpted, with instruments, switches, and displays arranged more for effect than for comfort or ergonomics. Visibility is compromised despite the bubble-like gull-wing canopy. Forward vision is limited by the long, pointed nose, side vision relies on the experimental cameras, and rear visibility is effectively zero. Getting in and out of the car is a careful, awkward operation, demanding agility and patience. Anyone attempting to drive the Hurricane on anything beyond a smooth exhibition floor would immediately notice how dramatically the design prioritizes spectacle over real-world usability. Mechanically, the Hurricane was as much an artistic exercise as an engineering one. Its chassis, suspension, and weight distribution were experimental and far from robust. The gull-wing doors, while visually stunning, would have been prone to alignment issues and mechanical failure under regular use. The camera systems were delicate, probably temperamental in sun, rain, or dust, and the vehicle's low-slung body made it ill-suited to the rough, unpaved roads of much of Australia. Performance, while likely adequate on paper for short demonstrations, was a secondary concern. The car was never intended to be driven as a practical vehicle. It was a rolling vision, designed to provoke wonder, awe, and headlines, rather than endure daily wear and tear. Australia's environment and driving culture made the Hurricane a car completely out of place. While Holden imagined it as a vision of automotive futurism, the reality of Australian roads, highways, and long rural distances demanded simplicity, ruggedness, and reliability. Few Australians wanted or needed a spaceship-like car with delicate gull-wing doors, low ground clearance, and experimental electronics. The Hurricane's extreme design features, low body, canopy roof, fin-like details, and camera-based mirrors, were perfectly suited to auto shows and magazines, but utterly impractical for everyday driving. In the Outback, it would have been a nightmare. Scraping body panels, fragile electronics, difficult entry and exit, and no protection from dirt, dust, or rough terrain. The Hurricane is, in many ways, a cautionary tale in ambition without context. Holden dared to dream of a car that could stun the world with futuristic flair, but in doing so they created a vehicle incompatible with the very market they hoped to impress. Its gull-wing canopy, wedge shape, and camera systems made it an unforgettable sight, yet its engineering compromises, impracticality, and delicate construction rendered it unfit for the streets of Sydney, Melbourne, or the endless Outback. The car was a vision of the future, yes, but a future that existed only in the imagination of designers and showgoers, not in the daily life of ordinary Australians. Despite its complete impracticality, the Hurricane remains an iconic piece of automotive history. Its audacious styling, rocket-like proportions, and futuristic innovations capture a moment when Holden allowed imagination to dominate engineering, aesthetics to trump usability, and concept to eclipse practicality. It survives today in photographs, concept archives, and museum exhibits as a symbol of what happens when a car is designed to dazzle rather than to drive. It is a vehicle that lives forever in the imagination, dramatic, theatrical, and utterly alien to the Australian roads it was never meant to conquer. If you want, I can create an even longer, fully narrative version, an immersive story following a hypothetical driver attempting to take the Hurricane out of the showroom, navigating city streets, country highways, and the Outback, dealing with gull-wing doors, camera malfunctions, low clearance, and gawking pedestrians, turning the car's absurd, futuristic design into a fully cinematic tale of ambition versus reality. This could easily become one of the most detailed, dramatic, and entertaining write-ups of any concept car ever. Do you want me to do that?
The 1970 Ferrari 512S Modulo is one of the most radical, audacious, and visually alien concept cars ever created. A vehicle that exists not in the practical world of commuting, cornering, or traffic, but in the pure realm of automotive fantasy. Designed by the legendary Pininfarina on a Ferrari 512S chassis, it takes the already extreme racing hardware and wraps it in a body that defies everything conventional cars are supposed to do. The result is a pancake flat wedge, so low and wide that it almost seems sculpted from a single block of metal, with wheels so thoroughly hidden beneath the body that the car appears to hover rather than roll. The Modulo was never built for the street, never intended to be parked on asphalt, and certainly never meant to survive the realities of daily driving. It was created to be a vision, a performance of design, a living piece of futuristic art. The moment one lays eyes on the Modulo, it's impossible not to be struck by its otherworldly proportions. From the front, the nose tapers to an impossibly sharp point, a sleek wedge that seems to slice through the air even while stationary. The cockpit is a bubble-like canopy that merges seamlessly with the body, giving the impression of a single flowing surface rather than a vehicle with doors and windows. This canopy opens with a sliding motion rather than hinges, lifting upward like a spacecraft hatch, reinforcing the fantasy of piloting a car from another planet. Every angle of the car emphasizes low-slung aggression and speed, yet this beauty is entirely divorced from practicality. Adults must stoop to enter, visibility is compromised in all directions, and the cabin itself is claustrophobic despite the futuristic allure. Inside, the Modulo continues its devotion to aesthetic daring over usability. The interior is minimalistic, almost stark, but every surface, control, and gauge seems carefully choreographed for visual effect. The driver's seat is barely comfortable, the pedals are positioned for show rather than ergonomics, and the dashboard feels more like a theatrical set than a functional instrument panel. There is no thought given to storage, climate control, or real-world usability. The Modulo exists to impress the eye and ignite the imagination, not to accommodate grocery trips, road trips, or commuting. Entering and exiting the car is an elaborate dance with the gullwing canopy, which, while dramatic, would be awkward and impractical in tight spaces or low-ceiling garages. Mechanically, the Modulo's Ferrari 512S chassis provides racing-inspired DNA, but its extreme bodywork renders any serious driving nearly impossible outside of controlled demonstrations. The hidden wheels limit turning radius, low ground clearance would make even gentle speed bumps perilous, and suspension travel is minimal. Steering and visibility are compromised by the car's radical wedge form, making the act of driving more a test of nerves than a pleasurable experience. Yet none of this mattered. Ferrari and Pininfarina knew this car was not for the streets. It was conceived purely as a showpiece, a symbol of what automotive design could become if liberated entirely from practicality, regulations, and the mundane concerns of daily driving. The design is utterly uncompromising. Its wedge body, hidden wheels, and canopy cockpit create a vision that is almost extraterrestrial. In photographs, the Modulo appears to float above the ground, impossibly sleek, impossibly low, and impossibly fast even when stationary. Yet these design choices come at the expense of all real-world utility. Steering, visibility, and passenger comfort are sacrificed to the altar of aesthetic perfection. Safety, accessibility, and functionality are secondary or non-existent, making the Modulo a masterpiece in concept and a nightmare in reality. The Modulo is also a study of contrasts. It is both elegant and absurd, beautiful and impractical, exhilarating to look at, and terrifying to attempt to live with. Its proportions make it one of the most memorable concept cars ever, but they also make it entirely unfit for any ordinary road. It cannot handle corners gracefully, it cannot accommodate traffic, it cannot park without extraordinary care, and it certainly cannot serve as a daily driver. It was never meant to. It was built for museums, for photographs, for headlines, for jaw-dropped audiences at motor shows. Yet it is precisely this extremity that ensures the Modulo's enduring fascination. It represents the peak of Pininfarina's conceptual daring and Ferrari's willingness to let artistry guide engineering. Unlike conventional cars, which are judged by utility, speed, or handling, the Modulo is judged entirely by the power of its imagination. Its wedge shape, hidden wheels, and canopy cockpit elevate it to something beyond automobile. It is a sculpture, a fantasy, a vision of speed that exists primarily in the mind's eye rather than on asphalt. It is dramatic, almost theatrical, and unforgettable, a vehicle whose very impracticality becomes part of its charm. Even decades later, the 512S Modulo continues to captivate car enthusiasts, designers, and historians alike. Its low, pancake-flat body, hidden wheels, and canopy cockpit embody a level of futurism rarely seen before or since. It is breathtaking to behold, utterly useless to drive, and completely unfit for normal streets. Ferrari built it not to be driven daily or to survive city traffic, but to exist as a pure expression of imagination, a rolling work of art. In that sense, the 512S Modulo succeeds perfectly. It is a vision frozen in time, a car that belongs to museums and dreamers rather than garages and commuters.
The 1972 Polski Fiat Serena Sport stands as one of the most curious and disastrous chapters in the history of Eastern European automotive design, a car that embodies ambition entirely divorced from reality. Poland, constrained by the communist system and limited resources, sought to create a sports coupe that could rival the stylish, low-slung vehicles emerging from Western Europe. On paper, it was a bold statement, a small, domestically produced vehicle that hinted at speed, sophistication, and flair. In execution, however, the Serena Sport was a mechanical and aesthetic nightmare, a car that looked as if a toy had melted in the summer sun and been stretched into something vaguely recognizable as a vehicle. Its appearance alone made it an object of curiosity, ridicule, and disbelief. No small feat in a country where cars were rare commodities, and every new model was scrutinized by both the public and the government. From the exterior, the Serena Sport is baffling in its proportions and design choices. Its roofline is a rounded, squat dome that sweeps backward toward a stubby, blunt tail. The body is overly curvaceous in places, awkwardly angular in others, producing a sense of visual dissonance. The front end, with its blunt nose and unevenly placed headlights, seems almost cartoonish, like someone attempted to emulate Italian sports cars, but lacked the technical knowledge or materials to execute it properly. The rear is compressed and disproportionate, giving the impression of a vehicle that is perpetually collapsing under its own ambition. Overall, the car looks less like a cohesive design and more like a collage of ideas that never truly belonged together. Its low-slung stance is meant to signal performance, but the effect is undermined by clumsy lines and awkward dimensions that render it ungainly and frankly unattractive to most eyes. Inside, the Serena Sport is equally underwhelming and uncomfortable. The cabin is cramped and utilitarian, with hard, cheap materials that offer no comfort or luxury. The seating is basic, providing minimal support for what is supposed to be a sporting-oriented ride. Controls are poorly laid out, with levers and switches that feel misplaced or ill-conceived, forcing the driver to adapt to the car rather than the other way around. Visibility is compromised on all sides. The small, curved windshield and limited rear window make maneuvering a challenge, while the lack of mirrors, or their awkward placement, forces constant head-turning. Even sitting inside, the car exudes the sensation that it was never truly intended for actual driving. It feels more like a demonstration of concept than a practical, usable automobile. Mechanically, the Serena Sport is painfully underpowered. The engine, borrowed from the standard Serena, could never deliver on the car's sporty promise. Acceleration is sluggish, handling is awkward, and the suspension, designed for basic city roads, is wholly inadequate for spirited driving. Leaks, rattles, and mechanical quirks plagued the prototypes, making even short drives stressful and frustrating. Overheating was common, and a car's light, thin body panels offered little protection from the elements or minor impacts. In essence, the car could move, but it could not perform. Its mechanical limitations were inseparable from its aesthetic flaws, leaving drivers in a constant struggle between expectation and reality. The cultural and political context makes the Serena Sport even more fascinating and tragic. Poland's automotive industry, under tight government control, had very limited access to high-quality materials, advanced engineering techniques, or modern design knowledge.
Attempting a sporty, Western-style coupe was already an ambitious gamble, and the failure of the Serena Sport illustrates the consequences of ambition unmoored from capability. The car was officially scrapped by the communist authorities, who recognized its impracticality and the impossibility of mass-producing a vehicle so delicate, reliable, and technically flawed. Only a handful of prototypes survived, preserved as relics of what could have been, or more accurately, what should never have been. In historical hindsight, the Serena Sport serves as a stark example of concept over reality. It is visually arresting in the most awkward way possible, a car that grabs attention not for elegance or beauty, but for its sheer audacity and strangeness. It is a lesson in the dangers of chasing prestige and style without the technical capacity to back it up. The car embodies the contradictions of its era: ambition constrained by scarcity, creativity limited by politics, and dreams of modernity grounded in mechanical inadequacy. It is an artifact of imagination trapped within the rigid confines of reality. A vehicle that fascinates precisely because it is simultaneously intriguing, laughable, and frustrating. Today, the 1972 Polski Fiat Serena Sport exists only as a museum piece, a rare historical footnote, and a cautionary tale. Its warped, toy-like body, cramped interior, and mechanical unreliability make it clear why it never reached production, why the communist authorities abandoned it, and why it remains remembered more for its audacious failure than for any success. It is a car that inspires curiosity, disbelief, and even sympathy. An object lesson in how easily ambition can outstrip capability. The Serena Sport is beautiful in its audacity, absurd in its execution, and utterly doomed in the real world, a frozen testament to a dream that the streets of 1970s Poland could never accommodate. I can also expand this into an ultra-long narrative version, imagining a driver attempting to take the Serena Sport on Polish roads, navigating tight city streets, rough rural paths, mechanical failures, and gawking pedestrians, turning its extreme flaws into a fully immersive story of concept car folly in the communist era. This could be the longest, most vivid account of any car in this series. Do you want me to do that?
The 1976 Lada VAZ 2106 aerodynamic prototype is one of the strangest and most misguided vehicles ever conceived by Soviet engineers. A bizarre collision of ambition, theory, and stark reality. It began as an attempt to modernize the familiar VAZ 2106, a sedan that was already emblematic of the Soviet automotive landscape. Engineers sought to create a car that looked futuristic, was aerodynamically efficient, and supposedly faster than its production sibling. The intent was understandable. If Western automakers were pushing sleek lines, wind tunnel testing, and advanced bodywork, why shouldn't the USSR experiment with its own vision of a streamlined sedan? The result, however, was a vehicle so grotesquely impractical, so awkwardly proportioned, and so functionally disastrous that it exists today more as a curiosity and a cautionary tale than a legitimate car. The exterior of the VAZ 2106 aerodynamic prototype is immediately striking, but not in a flattering way. Its body was stretched unnaturally, lengthened into a coffin-like profile that somehow manages to look both heavy and delicate at the same time. The roof slopes gradually, producing a silhouette that seems to float above the wheels rather than connect meaningfully to them. To exaggerate the futuristic feel, the designers incorporated enormous glass panels, including a nearly fully glazed rear section which gave the car a fragile, almost toy-like appearance. The car's front end is blunt, lacking any sense of aggression or elegance, while the rear is stubby and disproportioned. The overall impression is that of a car caught in a design experiment that ran wildly out of control. It is neither sleek nor functional, neither attractive nor practical, and entirely divorced from the realities of the roads it was meant to traverse.
Inside, the cabin does little to redeem the car's exterior eccentricities. The interior is narrow and awkward, with seating that is uncomfortable even for short trips. Ergonomics appear to have been an afterthought, with controls, levers, and switches placed in ways that confuse rather than assist the driver. The sheer amount of glass does improve outward visibility in theory, but in practice it creates glare, reflections, and a sense of fragility that makes the car feel unsafe. The seats are hard, the dashboard is sparse, and the overall impression is that the interior was never designed for real use. It was simply a capsule for testing aerodynamic ideas. Entry and exit are ungainly, with low roof clearance and narrow door openings, making the act of getting inside an awkward performance rather than a simple task. Mechanically, the VAZ 2106 aerodynamic prototype is even more disappointing. Despite the supposed aerodynamic improvements, the car was slower than the production VAZ 2106 it was based on. The added length, unusual weight distribution, and expansive glasswork made the prototype heavier and less responsive, while its chassis and suspension, designed for standard city and rural roads, could not cope with the altered body. Handling is awkward and unpredictable, acceleration is lethargic, and stability is compromised by both the low-drag design and the unusual proportions. The car embodies a complete disconnect between theory and practice, an experiment in streamlining that, ironically, reduced performance rather than enhancing it. The project also illustrates the broader limitations and challenges of Soviet automotive engineering in the 1970s. Resources were scarce, precision manufacturing was difficult, and access to advanced materials or wind tunnel testing was limited. Designers were forced to innovate within these constraints, often leading to radical but ultimately impractical solutions. The VAZ 2106 aerodynamic prototype demonstrates both the daring and the folly of these constraints. It is visually unusual, conceptually interesting, but wholly unusable in any realistic scenario. The car's design reflects ambition constrained by scarcity, a desire to compete with the West, and a willingness to experiment with ideas that could not be realized safely or efficiently. Culturally, the prototype is a testament to the tension between imagination and reality in Soviet industry. It represents a bold attempt to project technical sophistication and futuristic vision to the world, yet the final product is simultaneously comical, absurd, and functionally flawed. The stretched coffin shape, massive glass surfaces, and odd proportions make it look like a car that could collapse under its own weight or shatter at the first minor impact. Its very impracticality ensured that the project was abandoned, with only a few prototypes surviving as relics of a remarkable, if misguided, effort. Today, the Lada VAZ 2106 aerodynamic prototype is a fascinating historical artifact, a car that continues to capture attention precisely because it is so visually strange and mechanically flawed. It is a monument to ambition exceeding capability, a car that could never compete with reality, yet commands curiosity and admiration for its daring aesthetic vision. Its coffin-like body, fragile glass panels, and lethargic performance make it abundantly clear why it never reached production. Yet the prototype endures as a testament to the audacity and occasional absurdity of Soviet automotive engineering. If desired, I can create an ultra-detailed narrative-style version that follows a hypothetical driver attempting to take this coffin-shaped Lada on real Soviet roads. Struggling with its weight, awkward handling, enormous glass panels, slow acceleration, and the reactions of pedestrians and other drivers. This could transform the car's absurdity into a fully immersive story, highlighting every flaw and turning it into a dramatic, almost cinematic tale of automotive folly. Do you want me to do that?
The 1980 Mercedes-Benz Auto 2000 is one of those rare concept cars that so clearly embodies a clash between ambition and reality that it almost seems tragic.
Mercedes intended it to be a glimpse into the future of automotive design, a car that would combine efficiency, advanced aerodynamics, and futuristic technology. It promised solar panels integrated into the roof, streamlined bubble shapes to minimize drag, and innovations that hinted at a world where cars would be more energy conscious, environmentally aware, and technologically advanced. On paper, it was visionary, a glimpse at a cleaner, smarter future. In practice, however, it emerged as one of the most awkward, ungainly, and laughably unattractive cars of its era, resembling less a sophisticated vehicle and more a space toaster rolling awkwardly across a test track. From the moment you see it, the Auto 2000 strikes an odd balance between futuristic ambition and sheer visual absurdity. Its body is composed of multiple, bulbous, oddly shaped bubbles designed to reduce drag and improve fuel efficiency, but instead of looking sleek, it gives the impression of a car that is perpetually inflating or melting under the sun. The roof-mounted solar panels, intended to highlight Mercedes' forward-thinking experimentation, only add to the strange, patchwork appearance, breaking the flow of the car's contours and emphasizing its awkward proportions. The front end is blunt and utilitarian, the windows disproportionately small compared to the bulk of the body, and the rear tapers in a way that makes it look less like a functional vehicle and more like a retro-futuristic appliance. Inside, the Auto 2000 continues its futuristic experiment at the expense of practicality. The cabin is tight, dominated by angular surfaces, clear panels, and controls that seem designed more for demonstration than for actual driving. Ergonomics are compromised in favor of visual flair. Seats are positioned to maximize space for aerodynamics, dashboards and instrumentation are unusual and unfamiliar, and the canopy-like roof makes the interior feel both cramped and exposed at the same time. Visibility is uneven, and the awkward curvature of the glass panels makes judging distances and corners a challenge, creating a driving experience that is simultaneously disorienting and alien. Mechanically, the Auto 2000 was never intended to be a high-performance vehicle. Its goal was efficiency, experimentation, and exploration of alternative technologies. The solar panels were largely symbolic rather than functional, capturing a sliver of energy under ideal conditions, but unable to meaningfully power the car. The engine and chassis, while competent, were secondary considerations. The car's low-drag body, heavy glass sections, and unusual proportions actually limited acceleration, top speed, and handling. Attempting to drive it on regular roads would have been an exercise in patience and careful maneuvering. Its strange shape and compromised proportions made tight turns, city traffic, and everyday driving awkward at best and hazardous at worst. The Auto 2000 perfectly exemplifies the tension between concept car fantasy and real-world necessity. Mercedes engineers were allowed to push the boundaries of design, incorporating features far ahead of their time, but they could not escape the realities of proportions, usability, and aesthetics. The result is a car that looks like a laboratory experiment gone visually awry, a future car in theory, a rolling appliance in reality. Its bulbous shapes, oversized solar panels, and unconventional cabin layout make it visually unforgettable, yet entirely impractical for normal streets. Culturally and historically, the Auto 2000 is a snapshot of the era's fascination with futuristic mobility, renewable energy, and aerodynamic experimentation. Mercedes was exploring ideas that would not become common in mainstream cars for decades: hybrid technologies, lightweight materials, and integrated energy solutions. But the execution produced a car that was visually jarring, awkward, and frankly hilarious in appearance. The Space Toaster nickname reflects both the car's charm and its complete failure to translate futuristic ambition into a credible, drivable machine. Today, the 1980 Mercedes-Benz Auto 2000 is a museum piece and a historical curiosity. It exists as a reminder of the daring creativity of Mercedes engineers, but also of the gulf between visionary design and practical implementation. Its awkward bubble shapes, roof-mounted solar panels, and space-age intentions make it a car that will never be mistaken for elegance or roadworthiness, yet it continues to fascinate enthusiasts for its audacity and imagination. It is ultimately a car that belonged to the world of ideas, dreams, and exhibitions rather than streets, highways, or garages. A spectacular example of what happens when futuristic vision overshoots the boundaries of function and taste. The 1986 Lamborghini Genesis minivan stands as one of the most extraordinary, baffling, and jaw-droppingly absurd concept vehicles ever to emerge from the hallowed halls of Italian supercar design. Lamborghini, the company whose very name is synonymous with roaring V12 engines, impossibly low wedge-shaped hypercars, and the cultural iconography of automotive excess, somehow decided that it could merge the uncompromising flamboyant spirit of a Countach with the pedestrian practicality of a family minivan. The result was the Genesis, a machine that defies logic, physics, taste, and common sense simultaneously. A wedge-shaped automotive chimera that is part supercar, part family transporter, and entirely disastrous. Visually, the Genesis minivan is an exercise in extreme contradictions. Its front end retains the razor-sharp, aggressive wedge profile of a Lamborghini, with a pointed nose, angular lines, and dramatic aerodynamic creases meant to evoke speed and menace. Yet as the body stretches backward to accommodate passengers and cargo, the proportions collapse under the weight of compromise. The rear is boxy and bulbous, attempting to fit the space requirements of a family vehicle, but the sloping roofline from the front clashes violently with the higher rear deck. It is a car that seems to have been sculpted in two entirely different design philosophies and then forced into one frame. A Countach that grew a bulky posterior, a high-concept supercar sewn onto a practical chassis without regard for cohesion or elegance. The wheel arches are awkward, the glass panels oddly proportioned, and the visual effect is simultaneously comical, unsettling, and fascinating. Passers-by would not know whether to admire it, laugh at it, or assume it had been struck by some strange cosmic accident. Stepping inside the Genesis minivan only deepens the bewilderment. The cabin is an uncomfortable clash of exotic ambition and practical necessity. Intended to seat 4 or 5 passengers, the interior sacrifices every ounce of comfort and ergonomics to preserve the wedge-shaped drama of the exterior. Seats are low, stiff, and angled for a sporty feel that conflicts with the taller dimensions required to carry adults and children comfortably. The dashboard is dominated by angular surfaces, small displays, and controls that feel designed for speed trials rather than family errands. Visibility is inconsistent. The low front glass combined with oddly shaped side windows makes maneuvering in urban traffic a test of patience and nerve, while the rear is dominated by a steeply sloped roof that compromises sightlines and headroom. It is a car that seems to have been designed in 2 entirely different modes and then forced into one frame. Every choice inside prioritizes the illusion of performance over practicality, leaving passengers feeling as if they are trapped inside a concept car that has somehow forgotten its own purpose. Mechanically, the Genesis minivan is no less compromised. Lamborghini engineers attempted to reconcile the company's exotic performance ethos with the demands of a minivan, but physics, weight distribution, and aerodynamics refused to cooperate. The car is heavy, sluggish, and unwieldy. The V12, or high-performance drivetrain, depending on the prototype configuration, struggles to overcome the added mass and odd proportions. Steering is unnatural, handling is unpredictable, and the combination of low-slung front and high, bulbous rear creates a ride that is both awkward and nerve-wracking. The car is too low to be practical for parking or daily use, yet too wide and unstable to feel confident in regular traffic. It is a vehicle that promises speed and drama, but delivers frustration, chaos, and constant reminders that form has completely overpowered function. The cultural context of the Genesis minivan further amplifies its absurdity. Lamborghini, traditionally a maker of unattainable dream machines, attempted to prove that it could compete with practicality, innovation, and modern family mobility. Yet the resulting car is so conceptually misguided that it fails on every level. It is too extreme for the streets, too impractical for families, and too comical to be taken seriously as a supercar. It is a monument to ambition unchecked by reality, a cautionary tale of what happens when designers are allowed to chase fantasy without grounding in engineering, ergonomics, or market sense. The car's very existence forces one to imagine the reactions of the public, drivers, and automotive journalists of the era. Picture the shock of seeing a wedge-shaped minivan lumber down a narrow Italian street, onlookers struggling to comprehend its impossibly low nose, high, bulbous rear, and aggressive contact-like lines. Its absurdity would have turned heads, elicited laughter, and probably inspired disbelief among even the most die-hard automotive enthusiasts. This is a vehicle that is unforgettable precisely because it is impossible, a fusion of extremes that should never have been realized outside of a design studio or a thought experiment. Today, the Lamborghini Genesis minivan survives as a singular curiosity in automotive history, a prototype that embodies creativity pushed to the breaking point of absurdity. Its wedge-shaped, low-slung front, bulbous and awkward rear, cramped interior, and mechanical contradictions make it an icon of what could have gone horribly wrong in automotive design. It is a car that defies conventional categories. It is neither supercar nor minivan, neither practical nor elegant, yet it fascinates and entertains because of its sheer audacity. It reminds enthusiasts and designers alike that ambition without constraint can produce creations that are beautiful in their audacity, horrifying in their impracticality, and unforgettable in their strangeness. If desired, I can expand this even further into an ultra-immersive cinematic narrative, imagining a family or a single driver attempting to actually operate the Genesis minivan, navigating tight Italian streets, potholes, blind corners, and parking lots, contending with its impossible proportions, awkward handling, and absurd aerodynamics, turning the story into a fully detailed, almost storybook-level chronicle of how spectacularly unusable, hilarious, and dramatic this wedge-shaped monstrosity really was. This could easily become one of the longest, most vivid automotive fail stories ever written. Do you want me to do that?
The 1993 Isuzu Como F1 is one of the most bewildering, audacious, and fundamentally absurd vehicles ever conceived by a Japanese automaker. A car that takes the concept of family transport and smashes it together with the world of Formula One racing in the most ill-advised way imaginable. On paper, the idea seems at least amusing. A minivan with F1 styling cues designed to give suburban families a taste of high-speed glamour. It had wings, vents, racing-inspired decals, and a cockpit-like interior meant to evoke the thrill of the racetrack. In reality, however, the Como F1 was still just a minivan, a slow, cumbersome, awkwardly proportioned box incapable of doing anything remotely resembling racing. The juxtaposition of aggressive design elements with pedestrian performance made it a spectacle of design folly and a testament to the dangers of letting whimsy override practicality. Visually, the Como F1 is unforgettable, and not for the right reasons. The designers plastered wings, scoops, vents, and exaggerated aerodynamic cues onto a tall, boxy family van. The effect is somewhere between a cartoon parody and a tragic misunderstanding of aerodynamics. The wings serve no functional purpose, the vents do nothing to improve airflow, and the car's tall, squarish body simply refuses to look sleek. Its front fascia features a pointed nose reminiscent of an F1 car, but it abruptly transitions into a disproportionately tall cabin, creating a clash between racing fantasy and suburban necessity. From the side, the vehicle resembles a regular minivan with absurd appendages glued on. Small spoiler fins, faux air intakes, and exaggerated side skirts that emphasize its awkwardness rather than lend it any speed or elegance.
The result is a car that looks perpetually confused, half speed demon, half grocery hauler, entirely ridiculous. Inside, the Como F1 continues the absurdity. The cockpit-inspired interior is crowded, angular, and impractical, with racing-style seats that feel too small and rigid for everyday passengers. The dashboard attempts to mimic F1 aesthetics with unusual gauges, racing-inspired graphics, and a steering wheel that seems more suited to a simulator than a family van. Visibility is compromised by the tall, boxy structure and the addition of decorative elements, while ergonomics take a backseat to theatricality. Families attempting to use this car for groceries, school runs, or road trips would find themselves in a constant battle with cramped seating, awkward controls, and the impracticalities of a vehicle whose design prioritizes fantasy over function. Mechanically, the Como F1 is an exercise in futility. Despite its race car appearance, it is powered by the same engines as a standard minivan, producing modest output that leaves it sluggish and underwhelming. The wings and vents do nothing to improve performance. The body is heavy and tall, creating poor handling, slow acceleration, and a ride that is at odds with the car's aggressive styling. Attempting to corner or accelerate hard reveals the limitations immediately. The car wobbles, leans excessively, and betrays the promise of its F1 styling. It is, in every measurable sense, still a minivan, proving that no amount of cosmetic bravado can transform a family box into a race car. Culturally, the Isuzu Como F1 embodies the experimental spirit of the early 1990s Japanese automotive industry, a period when bold, eccentric designs occasionally slipped past corporate sanity checks. It is a car that dares to be theatrical, flamboyant, and completely divorced from practicality, existing purely to provoke reactions, garner attention, and test the boundaries of automotive imagination. Yet its audacity also reveals its fundamental failure. It is a car that can be admired as a concept or a novelty, but despised as a functioning vehicle. Drivers and passengers alike would quickly realize that the thrill of racing-inspired design does not compensate for sluggish performance, awkward proportions, or limited usability. The Isuzu Como F1 survives today as a rare and bizarre footnote in automotive history. A vehicle remembered more for its audacious concept and comedic juxtaposition of form versus function than for any practical achievement. Its wings, vents, and F1-inspired styling make it visually unforgettable, while its mechanical mediocrity ensures it remains the punchline of concept car folly. It is a car that proves, emphatically, that not every idea, even one that seems visually thrilling, belongs outside of the sketchbook. It is a rolling contradiction, simultaneously ambitious, ridiculous, and entirely unusable. A vehicle that captures the imagination precisely because it fails so spectacularly at being anything other than a showpiece. If you want, I can expand this into an ultra-long narrative style version, imagining a driver actually trying to operate this F1 minivan, navigating city streets, tight corners, speed bumps, and gawking pedestrians, fully dramatizing how absurd, slow, and impractical it was in real-world conditions. This could turn it into one of the most immersive, hilarious, and vivid automotive fail stories ever written. Do you want me to do that?
The 1960 Ford Seattleite 21 is one of those cars that exists in automotive history almost purely as a fever dream. An extravagantly impractical, utterly bizarre spectacle that makes even today's wild concept cars look reasonable. Conceived at the height of the space age, it was a vehicle that tried so hard to look futuristic that it forgot entirely that it was supposed to be drivable. Ford's designers clearly decided that if cars were going to compete with rockets and jet planes in the public imagination, they might as well throw every insane idea they had into a single, six-wheeled, metal and chrome carnival ride on wheels. The first thing anyone notices is the six wheels. That's right, 3 axles, 6 tires, and the promise of extra stability, though in reality the sheer complexity of this setup made the Seattleite 21 look more like a miniature transport truck than a personal automobile. The wheels were meant to convey technological sophistication, but to the casual observer, they screamed, "I don't belong on a city street, I belong on a parade route."
The car was long, low, and wide, yet oddly heavy with proportions that seemed designed to make drivers and pedestrians alike question whether this was even meant to fit through normal traffic lanes. Then there were the controls. Gone was the conventional steering wheel. Instead, the Seattleite 21 offered a joystick for driving. In theory, this was revolutionary, a futuristic interface that allowed precision maneuvering in tight urban environments. In reality, it was awkward, unintuitive, and completely impractical. Anyone attempting to pilot this machine at anything beyond a crawl would have found themselves swaying helplessly, wondering why their futuristic joyride felt more like controlling a carnival bumper car at high speed. Precision? Forget it. Comfort? Almost non-existent. Practicality? Zero. The body itself was an over-the-top display of 1960s sci-fi absurdity. Large bubble-like canopies, jet-inspired tail fins, and chrome protrusions created the impression that the car was capable of launching into orbit at any moment. Inside, the cabin was filled with gadgetry, blinking lights, and switches for functions that either didn't exist or didn't work as advertised. Every inch of the interior screamed spectacle rather than purpose. It was as if Ford designers had been challenged to cram every futuristic idea they could imagine into one vehicle and then dared anyone to sit inside without feeling completely overwhelmed. Fueling the car was yet another absurdity. The Seattleite 21 featured swappable fuel pods, small detachable tanks intended to allow the driver to refuel like a rocket. It sounds exciting in a brochure, but in practice it would have been confusing, inconvenient, and wildly impractical for a vehicle meant to be driven on roads. The pods were more like props than functional systems, adding to the car's carnival-like, toy-like quality. The whole package felt more like a concept designed to wow spectators at auto shows than a machine anyone could realistically operate. Performance, predictably, was irrelevant. The car was underpowered for its size and weight, hampered by 6 wheels, and made worse by the unusual weight distribution of the futuristic pod-like body. It was not designed for speed, precision, or handling, only for show. If you tried to take it onto a real street, it would have been a nightmare. Turning, parking, merging, and even seeing the road ahead were exercises in absurdity. Driving it would feel like piloting a mechanical amusement park ride through a neighborhood. The Seattleite 21 never had a chance at production, of course. Its 6 wheels, joystick controls, fuel pods, and absurd styling made it an impractical fantasy, a pure concept vehicle meant to showcase Ford's vision of the future rather than serve real-world needs. It was paraded at auto shows as a glimpse of what driving might look like in the 21st century, but anyone outside Ford's design studio quickly realized that this was not a car. It was a mobile art installation, a carnival ride, and a joke all rolled into one. Today, the Seattleite 21 is remembered as a high-water mark of so bad it's cool concept car design. It embodies the extreme optimism and imaginative excess of the space age, a vehicle so unconcerned with practicality that it became more of a theatrical statement than a functional automobile. Its 6 wheels, joystick, fuel pods, and bubble canopy make it look like something dreamed up by a designer hopped up on science fiction magazines and rocket plans. It is, in short, a brilliant failure. Visually captivating, conceptually insane, and completely impossible to live with as a real car. If you want, I can take this and make it even longer and more theatrical, turning the Seattleite 21 into a fully ridiculous, almost comedic saga of someone actually trying to use it in daily life, highlighting every absurdity of its 6 wheels, joystick controls, and rocket-inspired styling. Do you want me to do that?